Hello and welcome to this BTEC Level 3 Nationals in Children's Play Learning and Development 2016 Lead Examiner Feedback Session for Unit 2, January 2022 session. So the aims of this session are to look at examples of learner responses from the January 2022 series, look at how the responses met the marks required in the mark bands awarded, and provide examples of how learners can achieve higher marks. Please refer to Part A and Part B of the assessment task and lead examiner's report for January 2022 series for this feedback session. Part A provided the learners with a case study. Part A provided the learners with information as to what the 3 activities in Part B will entail. For example, the setting in this case study is a childminder with age ranges between 12 months and 3 years. This paragraph usually provides the learner with an insight into focus of the Part B assessment. In this case, it pointed to the feedback that is provided to parents and the value of this. Therefore, learners would have been expected to undertake research into the ways in which feedback can be provided to parents, such as tapestry and information from observations of their child. The key here was for learners to read the case study carefully. For example, the case study clearly says that Letitia values Piaget's observation strategies. This would have steered learners in the right direction for their research. On the other hand, the Part A case study also provided information that was not required in the Part B. For example, all the children have English as their first language, indicating that the tasks in Part B would not relate to children who are multilingual or have English as a second language. Activity 1. This activity always consists of 3 subtasks and should be responded to in the format of a report. The first part of the task relates to theory. In this instance, any theory was acceptable, providing it linked to the sequence of language development for children up to 3 years old. Some learners tended to name as many theories as possible without any direct link to the requirements of Activity 1. For example, a learner providing a response relating to Chomsky and the language acquisition device. Whilst this was an appropriate early years related theory, if there was no links to the information provided in the activity, then it was not credited. The example in the lead examiner report describes the sequence of language development covering stages between 12 months to 3 years, which showed links to this case study. The learner developed this further by providing examples of strategies that could be used to build on language development, for example, juice to orange juice. The second part of the task asked learners to make recommendations for providing an environment that encourages speech, communication and language. The learner response shown in the lead examiner's report demonstrated good understanding of how to create the environment. The learner referred to background noise and how this could be mitigated and/or utilised for best practice. The learner at points referred to theorists that were not relevant to the case study, such as Vygotsky, Brunner and scaffolding. The response then began to refer to labelling, which was not credited, as this links to reading, which is not relevant. There was mention of social interaction and how this will develop language, although this was only brief, and to gain further credit, the learner should have expanded on how the adult can influence the environment to encourage speech. The third part of the task related to Piaget's observation strategies and how this can provide parents with progress of their child's language development. The learner successfully applied Piaget's strategies and linked it to the use of observations within the setting, as it is required within the task. The learner provided ways in which parents can be informed of their child's progress, such as booklets. This is the marking grid, which never changes. The marking grid has two parts: recommendations and justification of recommendations. For recommendations, learners are awarded marks for the support activities and theory they make with reference to the case studies. The justification of the recommendation, learners are awarded marks for the use of appropriate theory to justify the recommendations. There is a maximum of 8 marks for the recommendations and 12 marks for justification. The learner response for the activity 1 in the lead examiner's report is a good piece of work, and the learner has made a good attempt to address all 3 aspects. The examiner has awarded 14 marks out of a possible 20. For the recommendations, the work makes references to the case study which are relevant to the context and meet all issues in the scenario. Band 3, 6 marks. The response did not meet the requirements of mark band 4, as the references to the case study were not sustained, and at points the response diverted away from the communication, language and speech, such as reading and labelling, and links to social interaction which were not relevant to the case study. For the justification, much of the theory was relevant, such as Brown and Piaget. However, links to Vygotsky and Brunner were not linked appropriately to the case study. The response demonstrated that the recommendations are on the whole examples of best practice and supported by early years theory, which in places this response in band 3. The marks were awarded for the middle of the band 8 marks, as the recommendations were not always fully relevant. To have received marks in band 4, the learner would have needed to include links to best practice that were fully justified, sustained and explicit. For example, the learner stated, children will be able to learn language through scaffolding used by the adults. The learner needed to have expanded what scaffolding is and how it would encourage language development. Tips for Activity 1. Learners should be encouraged to thoroughly read both Part A and the activity itself. Learners should look out for what age the children are and the resources they have available. Theory should be developed and linked to the activity. Learners should link the case study to a theory and not the other way round. Theory, best practice can come in the form of theory, curriculum, development matters, outcomes, phonetic approaches, etc. Theory should be threaded throughout the response. Theory and practice is everything an early years educator does, and learners should be able to read a case study and be able to recognise approaches and/or the theory being used. The use of subheadings will focus the learner. This does not provide additional marks, but we have found that this approach has enabled learners to focus their understanding for this activity. Ensure learners expand on their ideas. For example, simply suggesting scaffolding is not enough, and the learner must consider the mark bands in their response. Learners should be encouraged to consider whether their response is sustained and relevant to the case study. Activity 2. This activity always relates to a study of one child. In this example, it involved an 18-month-old who was being supported for their speech and language development. Learners should always read the requirements of the activity very carefully to ensure they provide an appropriate response. The example in the January 2022 lead examiner report demonstrated a good response. The learner has focused on actions relating to child-directed speech and refers to the alternative term parentes. The learner describes some details how child-directed speak for parentes can be used and provided a specific example of how Kishore could do this to support Bailey. The response was on the whole age appropriate, taking into account that Bailey was 18 months old. However, there was some reference to grammatical construction that was not fully understood or explained to meet the needs of an 18-month-old. The learner could have included an example here. The response demonstrates some good examples of how parentes can be used, for example, using high-pitched speech. The learner states that this will be engaging for Bailey and will invite them to respond. Whilst this is accurate, to achieve higher marks into Band 4, the learner should have indicated why this will be engaging and how might Bailey respond. Finally, the response made reference to examples of non-verbal communication. Eye contact was mentioned as an example, although this referred to being told off, which is poor practice, although using eye contact to show when Kishore was interested demonstrated best practice. The learner also mentioned that body language around Bailey should be open arms and not folded, but does not demonstrate how this will support Bailey's speech and language development. Marking grid for activity 2. The marking grid is the same and never changes. The marking grid has two parts: recommendations and justification of recommendations. For recommendations, learners are awarded marks for the support, activities and theory they make with reference to the details in the Activity 2 case study. For justification of the recommendations, which is the use of appropriate theory to justify the set of actions and support that is recommended. There is a maximum of 8 marks for recommendations and 12 marks for justification. The learner response for the Activity 2 in the lead examiner report is a good piece of work, and the learner has made a good attempt to address all aspects of the question relating back to the case study. The examiner has awarded 17 marks out of a possible 20. For the recommendations, the work has sustained references made to the case study, which are entirely relevant to the context. Band 4, mark 7. The references to the case study were sustained, although not all points were described thoroughly and required further development to achieve the top mark band 4 and full marks. For the justification, the response refers to an example relating to Bandura, which is relevant. The response demonstrated that all recommendations are good examples of best practice. There were some good examples of best practice, such as the use of different forms of non-verbal communication, although this was not sustained to meet the top of mark band 4 and full marks. To have received marks in mark band 4, the learner would have needed to include further links to theory and to provide further explicit justifications as to how the learner's ideas, such as eye contact, could be used to the benefit of the child's speech and language development. Tips for Activity 2. Learners should read the activity thoroughly. Learners should make note of what is being asked. Refer to the question. For example, the question is not suggesting that Bailey has any concerns with his speech and language, and therefore any reference to multi-agency working is not necessary and was not credited. Learners should stay within what is asked in the activity. The activity is asking about speech and language. Learners should refer to what supports this only. Any other suggestions will not credited. For example, contacting parents without any reference to speech and language development. The work should be age related. This is extremely important to understand and implement. The effects of activities or actions put on a child that is not suitable for their age can affect emotional development, such as encouraging a child to read or answer questions at age 18 months. Any actions for the child must be safe. Learners should also be reminded that any activities, strategies, or approaches must be safe for the child. Activity 3. This activity will always ask the learner to design 2 age-appropriate activities. In this example, the focus was on 3-year-olds developing an understanding of patterns using mathematical language. Learners should always read the requirements of the activity very carefully to ensure they provide an appropriate response. The activities should always refer to the role of the adult and appropriate theory and best practice. The example in the January 2022 lead examiner report demonstrates a good response for both of the activities. The first activity, the learner has provided an appropriate activity for understanding patterns. The learner provided subheadings which enabled structure to the requirements of the question. However, the role of the adult was implied and there was no reference to mathematical language, which was a requirement. The second activity is musical and therefore links to understanding patterns, although there is little reference to mathematical language and there is only an implied reference to the role of the adult. There are links to safety considerations, which was credited. Marking grid for activity 3. The marking grid never changes. This activity has 3 parts to the marking grid. There is a mark band for activity 1 and activity 2, and a third mark band for the justification of both activities. Marks are awarded holistically over the 2 activities and the final justification. For recommendations, each activity plan, learners were awarded marks for the role of the adult, the resources used, and how the activity meets the needs of the child. Is it age appropriate, health and safety, inclusion? For justification of the planned activities, the learner would need to consider linked theory and how the curriculum and best practice is used to inform the activities they have chosen. For example, making reference to areas of learning in the EYFS shape space measures. Example of activity in the EYFS show an interest in shape and space by playing with shapes or making arrangements with objects, such as have large and small blocks and boxes available for construction both indoors and outdoors. This is an activity for a child aged 30 to 50 months. This will encourage a child to build patterns and consider mathematical language. There is a maximum of 8 marks for each activity plan and 12 marks for the justification of the plans, with total marks for activity 3 being 28 marks. Activity Plan 1. This response was placed into mark band 3, 5 marks were awarded. Activity Plan 2. This response was placed in mark band 3, 5 marks were awarded. Justification of recommendations. This response was mark band 4, 10 marks were awarded. A total of 20 marks were awarded. The response demonstrated 2 detailed activity plans with clear description and shows how the activity meets and supports individual needs of the children and was awarded 5 marks for each activity. The learner could have received higher marks had they provided thorough details of the role of the adult and ensured that all of the requirements of the activity were covered, for example, the use of mathematical language. The response provided a good justification, and all recommendations are good examples of best practice. For the learner to have achieved 4 marks for Band 4, they would have needed to ensure that they provide a wide range of different theories, areas of the curriculum, as this example became repetitive. Tips for Activity 3. Use case studies during teaching and learning to encourage learners to develop age-related activities. Provide learners with an age range of a child and an area of learning from the EYFS and ask them to design a creative and age-appropriate activity. There is an activity plan template in the Practical Evidence Portfolio, which is a really useful tool. Planning of activities should be encouraged. This is important. Learners need to understand the importance of why early years educators plan activities in advance, such as to make sure there are enough resources, the importance of including all children, and how this can be achieved, the role of the adult in terms of support and health and safety, and what the child will learn. Learners should make good use of the EYFS. Learners should have a good understanding and application of theory. There are many theories available to support understanding of how and why children learn best. If the learners fully understand the theory, then they will be able to apply it to the design of their activity. For example, if a learner plans an activity whereby the adult demonstrates a task before the child completes it, the learner will be able to naturally and holistically incorporate the work of Bandura, here to highlight how children learn skills and behaviours from adults. All activities must be safe and age appropriate. Health and safety is paramount and must be considered in the design of the activity. Activities that are not safe, such as those involving potential choking hazards, burns from other ovens, and other dangers, examiners will keep the response for the activity in Mark Band 1. This qualification enables learners to gain a licence to practice, and the assessment team have to ensure that the learner is competent to work safely with children. Activities are far too complicated. Learners are getting lost in the activity, and as a consequence, they do not respond appropriately to what is required. Encourage learners during teaching and learning to create a bank of activities for different areas of development or learning that are creative and effective. Always remember the age of the child, and often the simpler the activity, the more opportunity for learning and enjoyment there will be. The role of the adult is often too generic. Learners need to consider the detailed role of the adult. This part of the activity is often generic, and we see sweeping statements such as supervise the children. To access the higher mark bands, learners need to consider how the adult can support the child, why they support the child, why the support from the adult will benefit the child, and/or when the adult must provide space for the child to build on their confidence and independent skills. Top tips. It is essential that the entire specification is delivered in order that learners can use their knowledge and understanding to respond to each of the 3 activities in the Part B assessment task. Centres should continue to provide learners with case studies relating to individual children across the different age ranges. Planning for Activity 3 is improving as are safety concerns. However, learners are not always fully demonstrating they are able to provide appropriate and age-related activities. Class activities aimed at providing learners with age-related scenarios would provide experience of application of knowledge to develop a range of appropriate activities which could then be applied to their Activity 3 responses. If you need any help or advice about delivering BTEC childcare qualifications, your subject advisor, Esther Traherne, will be happy to help. Thank you very much for listening to this session. And if you want to, you can go back and watch it again.